George Crabbe, William Blake, and Robert Burns, the last of the transitional poets who contributed significantly in the Romantic Revival. The three poets strongly opposed the neoclassical conventions and embraced Romanticism, which is quite noticeable in their works, which appeared in the last quarter of the 18th century. Any discussion on precursors of Romanticism would be incomplete without taking into account these writers. So, today our focus will be on these three poets. George Crabbe, the last of the Augustan poets. His literary mentors were Pope, Goldsmith, and Johnson. Crabbe used the conservative rhymed couplet in line with the neoclassical writers, but his poetry stands close to the Romantics. He is best known for his early use of the realistic narrative form and his descriptions of middle and working class life and people. He identifies himself with poor class and describes their life realistically. Rickett writes about Crabbe's humanism, quote, "No poet has a wider sympathy with his kind than he, or more stuff of humanity in his writings," unquote. Son of an exciseman, Crabbe was born at Alborough on the east coast of England. He was apprenticed to a surgeon, practiced medicine for a time, and then finally went to London to try his luck in literature. After encountering serious financial difficulties and enduring acute poverty, he sought and obtained the patronage of Edmund Burke. Burke helped him greatly both in his literary career and in building a role within the church. He then passed the rest of his life in ease and comfort, he serving as a minister first in his own parish and then at other places. Here are listed some of the important works of George Crabbe, and his first poem, The Library, was published in 1781. It is full of reflections on books and reading, but it is considered to be dull and unimportant. Now, it was his second poem, The Village, which established him as a poet. The poem was, however, corrected and revised by Johnson. Now, Crabbe had seen the hard life of villagers, and in this poem, he describes their poverty and misery, their struggles and vice in minute details. He protested against the falsehood of romantic fancy and he pleaded for truth in poetry. Cambridge History of English Literature writes, quote, "He gave the poetry of nature new worlds to conquer by showing that the world of plain fact and common detail may be material for poetry," unquote. Now, after The Village was published the newspaper in 1785, and after that came a gap of almost 20 years when no work of the author appeared. So after an interval of 22 years, the parish register appeared in 1807, and in the preface to this volume, Crabbe gives the reasons for this lapse as being his higher calling as a clergyman and his slow progress in poetic ability. In the poem, The Parish Register, he reviews the life of his parish during the whole year. And this was followed by the Borough, which is a descriptive of the life of a country town. And the last to be published in his lifetime were Tales in Verse and Tales of the Hall. And in both these tales, he included people of the upper classes, and the tales show him a competent narrator and reminds us of Chaucer. Now, when we look at his later works, then we see that the tone was softened to some extent, but his pessimism persisted to the last. It is a little difficult to classify Crabbe's works. He is noted for his unsentimental realism. He created a new way of presenting life and society. He breaks from the Augustan tradition in realistic narrative poetry, in detailing, in description and characterization, and in dealing with the middle and working class society instead of the aristocratic society. Now, by temperament and or maybe because of the sufferings of his youth, Crabbe dwelt on the darker side of life, and that is why Byron's description of him as nature's sternest painter, yet the best, is not unjust. He describes life or natural scenes in harsh aspects, and though anti-romantic by temperament, he links himself with Wordsworth and other romantics by his sympathy with the rustics and by his interest in nature. He does not, like Wordsworth, glorify the villagers or praise nature. He uses nature only as a background for scenes of life and character. In manner too, he was of the 18th century. He wrote in the couplet of Pope, but his couplets are neither elegant nor melodious. Crabbe is considered to be the most mediocre of the poets of his class. A critic writes that, quote, Crabbe in his verse tales in particular is an important, indeed a major poet whose work has been and still is seriously undervalued, unquote.